Thank you so much for making the time. I
No
am
problem.
I'm honestly very excited about this because the more I've thought about it, I think you're like the hidden gem of condos that in the mainstream in real estate nobody really knows. And
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
like I want to start off by obviously this is how I found you through this exciting book. So this book is actually really interesting because, first of all, I didn't even know it existed. And then there are so many questions when you're going through condos and stuff where this book literally addresses almost every single thing. It's very dense, so it's not a quick read, but it does make everybody very dangerous in the sense that you know the questions to ask. You may not understand everything, but it gives you the insight. So I guess what I wanted to start off with is you've been at this for a few decades. I want to kind of give people an understanding of why you've written this book. I mean, how we got to this book and kind of what you do in the condo space. And yeah, maybe you just start off there and I'll have some specific questions for you.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I've been working since 1990, so it's been a few years, that's for sure. And I'm an engineer, so I work in the field doing reserve fund studies for clients. Also do a lot of work on cost sharing agreements. And so I get into the sort of some of the worst circumstances in terms of difficulty in terms of condos. So that's always interesting. And then over the years, I've been involved, I do quite a bit of public speaking. So when that gets you out and kind of known. And then I got involved with the government when they were doing the amendments to the act last time. And while they weren't did they do amendments? We'll call it doing amendments in 2015, where they did a lot of public consultation and made some amendments, but didn't proclaim many of them. So there's a lot of changes that have been in the act for a decade that haven't actually been implemented, which is too bad. So I've been heavily involved there. And then I've been on several of the boards of the condominium associations. So CCI Toronto, I was on from 2008 till probably 3 or 4 years ago now, including as president for a term. And now I'm also on the board at CAI Canada, where I'm currently the board, which is Community Associations Institute. So both of those are associations that sort of advocate on behalf of the condo industry to the government, but also, they educate for CAI directors and managers, for CCI directors. So I've always been kind of heavily involved, and somehow I always managed to land in the place where I would get exposed to a lot of things outside of my realm, right? So I would, when I did the consultations in 2015, I was chairing the finances committee because of my reserve fund exposure, but I was on the expert panel, which was overseeing all of the amendments. So legal and, things about meetings and things about requisitions and whatever was happening in terms of topics. So I kind of got dragged into areas where I sort of had no right being. And then same thing happened when I was on the board at CCI. We took on the creation of the director's education for the Condo Authority of Ontario when it came on. We were sitting in CCI. We had a lot of education materials. They went out to the market saying, who can do the education for us? And we said, why don't we do it? Like CCI was not a consultancy, but they had all of the people in place to do that. So Tanya Halleck and I project managed that together, and we assembled the education that was used by the CAO for the first few years. They've modified it since, but and then I also chair an Ontario-wide education committee for CCI currently, and in that we've developed the education for directors. So there's 8 courses that directors can take to get a CCI certificate, basically, as a director. And so again, I'm in reviewing like handouts and all this content about topics that are far outside of my engineering role. So it's been really an interesting path, and I love it because I get to know all the lawyers, I get to know all the accountants, and kind of have to deal with their challenges as well as my own. So it's been a neat opportunity. It's been fun.
And now I think, is it fair to say that Synergy Partners, where you're a managing partner right now, you guys do performance studies, reserve fund studies, all the good stuff related
Yeah.
to at least condos is one aspect of it. Would it be fair to say, and to contextualize this, Tridel used to still kind of has the reputation of being the Mercedes-Benz of condos. So could we apply the same analogy to Synergy? Because I gotta say, so it's funny, after I read the book, we briefly spoke. I ended up buying actually a unit for a client of mine, like we just closed on a couple of weeks ago at one of the buildings that you guys manage, or do the reserve, you're the engineer on the
Engineer
status
for.
certificate. So I kind of told my client, I think this might be an indication that this is like the Mercedes-Benz of engineers if you see them on this condo board. So I think we're in good hands. We're really happy with the building. It's I'll disclose it's 88 Grandview
Yeah.
in North York. But anyway, so I think, yeah, I think based on that, you're probably very qualified to talk about a lot of things that I want to talk about. And again, this is coming from a real estate perspective.
Yeah.
Think of me. I'm just a regular person that I see a lot of condos, I see a lot of stuff, but obviously I don't have the engineering background to understand things. I've built stuff, but again, I'm not a professional. So,
Well, it interests me to have a conversation with you because you guys are the players who are never around in my conversation.
of
It's
course, why
true,
would
right?
be? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. I get it.
Like I deal with we deal with everything once the condos are in place and everybody's living in them and dealing with everything, right? You're putting people into them or taking them out of them, and just a different
Yeah.
perspective, right? And
Well,
I think
that's
sometimes people get answers from their brokers that are not necessarily factual, or even that the brokers won't be aware of a lot of the issues that condos face. Because why would you? Like how you're not exposed to the other end of it. So I think it's
So
interesting.
yeah, here's a very interesting perspective. I'll tell you. When the typical process when you buy a condo is you make it conditional on status certificate review. And it's
Mhm.
in theory based on education, that you get as a real estate broker or salesperson is you're not allowed to advise on the status certificate. That is
Yeah.
not your job. You go to the lawyer. Now, what's interesting with the lawyer is obviously I've worked with probably 2 dozen lawyers that my clients have introduced me throughout the years, and it's every status certificate review varies greatly. Some will dig, some will not. Some will basically summarize the status certificate and just there's no advisory, it's just a summary. So I saw this gap very early on. So for me, I started saving status certificates over the years. I have hundreds of them at this point,
Oh, interesting.
and it became a painstaking task to save all of this. But the reason I was doing it is to contextualize okay, if I want to buy at 501 Adelaide Avenue West, for example, this how many units, this is how old the building is. I need to compare it to something similar of that vintage because I can't compare it to 88 Grandview, which is an older building, completely different area. So I needed context, and this is why I started saving them so that I can be like, look, this is what the lawyer said, these are the issues, but here's what other buildings of similar, I guess that they're similar to this one look like, just so you have context of where we stand. So this is how this whole thing started. And then I started deep diving it, and then I realized the more I was learning, the more I realized I knew nothing. It's just you just dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's like this is insane, right? And then I'm like, I need to find something, and then I saw this book and I devoured it because I'm like, this is great. So the first thing I want to start with, just so something that's more recent, is during COVID, I guess. Um, I feel like a lot of reserve fund studies either got delayed, things weren't done in completion, maybe because of restrictions, they couldn't bring trades in, whatever the case may be. And I feel that now, over the last 12 to 18 months, everything's come to a head. We're seeing these massive overages in budgets, we're seeing these massive maintenance fee increases. There's just a bunch of stuff happening all at once. And I just wanted to get your perspective, maybe how do you feel, or like what is your take on the current state of reserve fund maintenance fees and all that stuff, and maybe relative to pre-COVID? Is it the same or are things a little bit more chaotic
This is
right now?
yeah, things are dramatically different. When you say budget overruns, are you saying on the operating side or total fees? You mean
So let's say if I had a status certificate in a building from 2021 and they assume this is the budget going forward, whatever the budget is, when you get the actuals 2 years later on the same building where I'm looking to buy, it's like you're looking at completely different actuals on the operational side. So
okay.
whether it is service contracts or whether it is a complete miss on scheduled maintenance that was supposed to be done, and obviously that translates into higher fees usually, or sometimes they just run the reserve fund lower. But it's just there's so many variables. So I just kind
Yeah.
of want to know, just
It,
overall, how do
yeah.
you feel? Like where are we right now?
I'm thinking where to start, where to start. Because obviously I mean, everybody knows there's been a lot of inflation in
Yes, inflation is
period
definitely a
2020
part
to
of it.
2023, let's say we've had massive inflation. And so on the operating side, it's been a big deal, right? But on the reserve side, it's been a massive deal. I brought up a couple of images that I use. Can I share
Okay.
those here?
Absolutely, please do. Let me
Let
see
me
if I
just,
can
sorry, I should have thought of that.
oh
See
my
the slide?
goodness.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
This is kind of interesting because this is a graph that's showing year over year what's the percentage change in consumer price index in the orange line or in what's called the building construction price index, which is
Mm,
for new construction, right? So that's what it costs to build, let's say, a new condo, residential construction. And so what you see is that historically, building construction costs were higher than CPI increases, consumer price index. except in 2008 where the crash happened, right? And then they pop up again. And then basically between 2020 and 2024, they just went crazy, right? So the cost of construction, now that was COVID, it was a lot of things kind of hitting all at once. It seems to have settled down again in 2024. And so that looks like a kind of one-time blip. But if you look at that, it's like, oh, here we go. If you look at that cumulatively over time,
Mm,
so this is saying, something that cost $100 in 2001 on the consumer side would now cost, 160, but on the construction side would now cost 300 and something. So there's been massive increase on those construction sides. So the consumer price is probably what's going to be reflected through the operating budget. Wages have gone up to match consumer price index. So you get those bumps and they've been significant. Like if I go back to this graph, this is not insignificant, this bump we had on the consumer price index, but that's going to hit your operating. Utilities are whatever the government does to them, basically. But on the construction side, what's interesting is that if I look at it, so if I look at the building construction price index, so the new construction between that period, it was that particular window, Q4 2020 to Q4 2023, right sort of COVID, like once COVID hit hard. It went up 69% over 3 years. Consumer price index went up 15%, but everybody's yelling about this, right? This is your price at the grocery store. Like this is making people panic. What they don't realize is that reserve funds are much closer to construction than they are to CPI. So all of the costs in the reserve funds have gone up a lot. And so we have this double whammy. We have the operating budgets coming up because of CPI, right? Inflationary impact on wages and those sorts of things. And we have this huge increase in construction. And so people sort of think, well, oh, good, the inflation, if I go back to this graph, the inflation's come back down, but that doesn't mean the prices have come down, right? That cumulative
right.
impact of the prices is still there unless we start to have deflation of those prices. And so what happens is basically if here, I think I have another one that shows another view. Oh, no, it's not here. Okay. So basically what's happened is we have this reserve fund concept where we do a reserve fund study every 3 years in this province for every corporation.
Yep.
And we have a 3-year window where inflation went crazy. And so depending on the timing of the study in a particular building, their last study will have caught 1, 2, or 3 years of that inflation. Right. And so
Yeah.
some of them that just caught the first bit, and even I have to say by 2022, early 2022, we were all saying maybe this is just a COVID blip. Prices are way up, but they're going to come back down. And then as we
Transitory.
got further into 2022, we're like, this is not coming back down again, right? We're not seeing deflation of these prices. So we started. So even the studies done in 2022 were probably tentative in their acceptance that this inflation was real. And so they will have had a big increase, but not everything. So it means that every study that's been done basically since 22, 23, 24 into 25 are all getting hit by this huge inflation. And how a reserve fund study is calculated is we calculate the cost to do every project as if it were being done this year,
Mm,
right? And then we
right.
inflate it to its future
Oh
position.
boy. Yeah.
So all of that inflation gets built into those prices, the current prices, and then future inflation, which we may be forecasting, we'll go back to a percent above CPI as a kind of reasonable basis. They'll get inflated from there, but they get that big bump up. And so that's going to translate through on the maintenance fee side in a big way, because suddenly you have, all of the costs in the whole study have come up by, let's say 30, 40, 50%. Now, so that means that every study I'm doing right now, we're seeing increases of 20, 30, 40, 50%. And it can get much worse than that if the condo is very old. And I'll give you an example. Let's say, well, you know what, I'm going to jump down to this, which I put in here. This is I thought I would put up some data that says, here is a study. This is just a study that I did last week.
That's
And I
awesome.
said to myself, where do the costs come from if I look at a study? And you're going to see windows. Do you see down here how windows in this
Yeah.
building are over $20 million to replace on an
L-
uninflated basis? Okay, so if they were done today,
Got it.
as
Yeah.
opposed to a lot of other projects, elevators are expensive, right? But look at them relative to windows, they're next to nothing.
Right.
And so in the scheme of things, and here's what the big challenge is if you're a newer building and the cost of your windows just went up by 50%, you still have 30 or 40 or 50 years to save for that. So the increase is tempered. If,
Right.
on the other hand, you're in an old building, and let's say you were planning to do the windows 8 years from now, and now the prices have gone up 50%. You don't have much time to save all that money, and it's very significant relative to the other costs. And so then that can drive that contribution way up. Now, in most cases, what a board is going to do is they're going to move the timing of that window project,
Mm.
right? They're going to say, what can we do to keep these windows alive? Can we change the weather stripping? Can we change some of the operables? Can we target, what can we do to try and
And
defer that? But it's still a
uh,
big impact.
so just on the topic of windows, because I know some places do them on an as needed basis. So like I just sold a condo last year. It's like, hey, my seal's busted. I want to sell
Yeah.
it. Please change it. So they came and did it within a month.
Yep.
But they do it only if you ask, right? You can see kind of looking at the condo in certain units, people just don't do anything about it, which is interesting. But my question is as follows. So I actually walked away from purchasing a unit for a client a couple of months ago, older building, and here's what happened. We purchased it, and then just as this was happening, they issued a special assessment and they had to borrow $11 million to do a big job. And that job was the windows. So apparently they had actually gone ahead and taken out a loan. This was approved. They've gotten the loan, they had done the windows. And then when we were buying, basically it was like, how are you guys going to pay for this to the owners? So everybody got hit with like a $25,000 special assessment. This building was, I believe, built in 89. So let's call it roughly 35 years or something. So my question is, okay, logically speaking, layman's person, I don't know anything about building management. I'm thinking to myself, the risk here is not that there was a special assessment that the owner just paid. The risk is that they knew this huge expense was coming for years. How is it that in 2024, when you did the window replacement, you didn't have the money? Like, what were you doing for the last 20 years leading up to it? And then what does that mean for the next 5, 10 years for every other thing? So like, can you shed some light on an example like this? Because I see it all the time.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to take two things apart. One, you mentioned replacing the glass. So there's a
Yeah.
big difference between replacing the glass and replacing the windows. So when
Okay.
you replace the glass, you're just coming in, you're taking out a sealed unit. There's retainers that pop off, the glass comes out, the new glass goes in, the retainers go back on, cheap and easy. And if
Okay.
anybody has a failed unit, they should report it to management and management should deal with it, right? So
Got it.
that's kind of one issue. When the building gets old enough that the windows have started to get rattly, or in that building, they were probably, the frames can sometimes start to sag. You can start to get way too many failures, where they're just spending way too much money each year on failures. They're leaky, they're drafty, they're rattling, there's some problem that's happening. The finish is gone on them. That's when you're going to do a replacement. So that's replacing the glass and the aluminum, all the framing around it, right? So it's a much more, that's the expensive project. I mean, the replacing of glass is expensive too, but it's just kind of an annual churn. It's not
Right.
a big cost. So then here's where the problem lies is if a lot of buildings came into COVID saying we need to replace our windows next year. Then COVID came along and they didn't want anybody in their suites,
Right.
right? And so they put the project off. Well, what they didn't realize was that by putting that project off, the price was going to go up by 50% or more. The window prices have
Oh,
gone through the roof. Like I've been at Synergy now, we started Synergy 10 years ago and I've been there for 10 years. And when we first started there, we were budgeting something like $300 a square meter for windows. And now when we're closing windows, they're coming in at 15 or $1,700 a square meter
wow.
in just 10
That's
years, right?
substantial. Yeah.
Oh, it's huge. And the frustrating part is that the biggest increase is on the most expensive component.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I didn't even realize I was going to ask you about it. So, for
Yeah.
example, I didn't realize windows were orders of magnitude more expensive than everything else. They talk about underground garage membranes, flat roofs, and all this stuff. But yeah, I guess it does make
I mean,
sense.
those are big too, right? Those are big
Right.
projects too, but it's the windows are almost always the biggest. But they're a long way out too, right? They're going to be out at 40, 50, 60 years. They're not in the first 20 years. So you have lots of
Oh,
time to
okay.
save for them. The problem is it's been such a moving target, right? If the price is increasing, if windows are inflating by 10% a year and the study is assuming that on average everything is going to inflate by 3%, then you're going to be short at every turn, right?
Yeah. So in the
Yeah.
case of this particular building, obviously I don't want to give the building name away because I don't want to get a cease and desist because the condo
Yeah.
boards love sending those out and I want
Yeah.
to play it nice. And by the way, it's not a bad building, but I do want to kind of like you obviously don't know anything about the building. I'm just giving you the facts. $11 million hit comes, special assessment for everybody. Good thing is, there's lots of equity in the building. The owners generally seem to have money. It got paid out fine. But what would you attribute to like they literally had nothing in the reserve. So first of all, $11 million hit, and then there was like $300,000 in the
Yeah, it's
reserve. Like,
unusual. I mean, I've
how does
seen
that
some
happen?
buildings where they're replacing the windows and they've saved up 10 million for it, but now it's 20, right? And they'll
Mm,
special assess the difference. It's unusual to go from 0 to 11. Like then doesn't make sense, right? What have you done? But you never know what's happened in the past. And
prior,
so
right?
you don't know that something else terrible didn't befall them recently. But more often, what happens is that the so ba you have to look at the history. If we go back, the Condo Act that we're following currently came about in 2001. So it's called the 1998 Condo Act, but it didn't come into force until 2001.
Hmm.
At that time, condos were given 3 years to do their first study. So for condos that were built before 2001, before May 5th, 2001, they would do their first study by 2004. Okay, so now some of them were doing studies before that, but there were no uh, kind of restrictions on funding, right? You didn't, how you funded it wasn't governed. So now the act says do your study by 2004. And by the way, for you old condos, we're going to give you 10 years to become adequately funded.
Mm,
Okay. Which makes no sense. It's like saying to someone, I know you're going to retire at 65, but we're not going to make you start saving till you're 50, right? Like, don't worry about it, which is mathematically dumb, right? But then, just to make it better, when the HST came out, they increased that to 15 years. So now 15 on 2004 means that the older condos didn't have to be adequately funded until 2019. And adequately
wow.
funded is not defined. Okay.
Okay.
And so nobody really knows what it means. Does it mean don't go negative ever? Does it mean increase should be limited to inflation? Like, what does it mean? It's not defined in the act. And so it's a wild west out there to a certain extent. And so what happened was a lot of these condos would do their first reserve fund, and the reserve fund study would say, you need to be putting away, 500,000 a year. And but we're putting away 30,000. We don't want to put away 500,000. So they delay, defer, we'll phase it in, we'll ramp it up, we'll delay it, we'll do whatever, and they mess around. And what ends up happening is you get a building that's 35 or 40 years old with $500,000 in the bank. But a 30 or 40-year-old building of significance, of 150 units, should have many millions in the reserve.
Wow. Okay. This is very
Yeah.
interesting. I had no idea that this.
Yeah.
So this is okay. So I have way too many questions. I'll just try to keep myself contained. So let me, again, I'm always keeping a client's hat on.
Yeah.
Like if I'm a buyer or a seller of a condo, because ultimately this is who this is to benefit, right? So
Hmm.
let's think as a buyer. I always had this, I guess, in my own head, based on what I had seen, I had developed this framework where to me, the most at-risk condos to buy were either the really new ones, so let's say less than 5 years old, less than 10 years old, because there's not enough historical precedent in terms of how it's managed. So that's number one. And the other group was a really old condo, right? And that's because you just, like you said, you have a bunch of deferred maintenance and you have like 800K in the reserve fund, like something's not right. I always thought the sweet spot was about 20 years old, 15 to 20, because I felt like within 15 to 20, you weren't paying the newness premium on a per square foot basis because they were already discounted because they're, 10 years old, they're not new anymore. But you also had this runway of like 10 years where you should be risk free. Nothing major should happen because if anything major did happen, it should have been addressed by now. And the big things usually start hitting at like 30, 35 years. Tell me how wrong, like this is very, very high
Yeah, no,
level.
I mean, you're not far off. But I think I think what people don't realize is the reason for it. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom. So I will say one thing, and that is when you look at older condos, there are some very well run condos, right? So you can go into a condo that has only $800,000 in the bank, but if they have a new roof, new windows, new boilers, new chiller, the garage is in good shape, and the plants look nice outside, the carpets look good, the amenities are, then they're doing everything right. They don't need a big balance because they've already renewed everything,
Right.
right? If you go into an older condo and it has $800,000 in the bank and you can tell that the place is falling apart, then that's a different kettle of fish, right?
Yeah.
So they both exist there. Okay, so that's one point. The other one would be, let's talk about new ones. So right now the Condo Act says until you do the first reserve fund study, you can put in 10% of the operating budget into reserve. And so what happens in this province, and some builders will go higher than that, but 10% is not enough by a long shot. Okay. That number should be much closer to 25 or 30% of the budget. And so every single reserve fund study that's done in the first year says your fees are 1/3 of what they should be on the reserve contribution. So we should yank you up. I'm looking at one yesterday, they were putting in, I think, $900 a unit a year, and they need to be up at $3,500 a unit a
Oh,
year. Okay. Now,
wow.
3,500 a unit a year is a normal, that's a good reserve contribution. That should be where condos should be. If you're in a house, that's what you spend, right? On your roof and your pavement, and your windows, et cetera, on average. So that's the right number, but they're not there. So now what do? I say to the board, you're way underfunded. We need to get you up. But they have 20 years where they don't need to spend anything. Like there's nothing that needs to be replaced. So it's just putting money in an account for the future. And so almost all the boards, with very few exceptions, they want desperately to avoid those fee increases. And I totally get it. Like people have just been lied to about what it's going to cost to live in this building,
Yeah,
and now they're being told the truth and they don't like the truth. And matter of fact, they can't afford the truth because a lot of them are
right.
young and they're stretched to the limit. And the whole thing is, I mean, I've been yelling about this since 2015, when I kind of really got my arms around it to say, like, if we tell people that it's 10% of operating and they go to the bank and say, how much can I borrow? And they say, what are your maintenance fees? And they tell them this number, which is artificially low. Guess what? The bank will lend them more. And now the
Yeah,
bank lends them more. So now they have more mortgage than they should have. Then the fees get right sized because there's a lot of other pressures on first year to second year transition as well, not just the reserve, but the reserve goes up and the operating budget gets made realistic. And there's such a huge increase in fees. So now their fees are much higher. The bank wouldn't have lent them that much,
yeah,
right? If they had
yeah,
known
yeah,
that that's what those fees were. So then you've got these people kind of trapped. So they're trapped, they're in for, it's too expensive. And so the board wants to smooth out the increase in the fees, right? So they want to blend it, avoid it, do something. And so what's interesting is that you don't know that you're off track. So let's say you're a board and you're happily putting money in the reserve for the first 15 years and you're following some plan that says, go ahead, like defer on to future owners. Do you know what I mean? If
yeah.
your inflation assumption is 2% or 3%, let's increase the contributions by 5% or 7% a year, right? And so that lets you start low and get high. But for the first 20 years, it's pain free, right? There's no expenditure, so you don't know you're underfunded. But all it takes is one early expenditure. Something fails, an HVAC expansion joint, something, that needs a big spend. Your fund gets depleted. You think, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And then you get a serious reserve fund study, and suddenly you're seriously underfunded. So 17 to 20 is actually, from a reserve perspective, if they transition to someone who's actually making sure that they're properly funded, that can be one of the most painful times on the reserve fund front, which can have a big
Mm,
impact, obviously. Because what's interesting is, when you get the status certificate, it has the notice of future funding on the back.
yeah,
And you
yeah,
know how it always has like early increases are
yeah,
bigger and
yeah,
then they get smaller, right?
yeah. 25 years out, and the
Okay.
precision is amazing.
So here's
Yeah,
what's dumb about those forms is we have to print 30 years of data,
yeah.
but the only ones that you can count on are the first 3 years.
That makes sense
Okay,
because
so the
it's two and a
first three
half, two
contributions,
for
that's
everything
it.
else. Yeah,
Yeah. Because after that, you need to do your next study, right? And then there's a whole
right.
bunch of forces that are going to drive up those costs, So if you're looking at it, don't ever tell somebody, oh, once you get through this tough time, it's going to be fine. Because that's not true. Once you get through this tough time, you can do the next update on the reserve fund. So anyway, so new ones risky because the reserve is low, the first year budget is low. The second year budget should right size things on the operating side. On the reserve side, you want to watch for boards that are doing big deferrals. Now, depends on your time horizon. If you want to live there from year 1 to 6, then fine, right? You're good. If you plan to stay longer, you may get into the painful period. In that 15 to 20-year period, what you want to look at is are they following a notice that is deferring onto future owners? In other words, is that year over year increase for the 30 years a lot higher than the inflation assumption?
Okay.
Right? Which is basically saying rather than us increase to match inflation, we're going to let those fees rise faster than inflation, which is then has the net effect of having current owners put in less and future owners put in more.
I
And
see.
it only works in that first 20 years when you don't need to spend much, but it leaves you very short of money by year 20. You kind of keep deferring and deferring at each update to avoid paying. And so you want to see a study that has that more characteristic, 3 increases above inflation and then inflation matched. If you're seeing a condo at 17 to 20 that's doing that, or 15 to 20 that's that, you're probably okay. If you're seeing one where you see 2 or 3% above inflation for the whole thing, then that will come to roost fairly
Yeah.
soon. Because once they start to spend, it has to come to roost.
That's okay. That's very enlightening.
It's complex, right? It's tricky. Like it's
It
tricky to
is
say
tricky,
one
especially
word.
if I don't have the stuff in front of you, but I understand
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying. It's just because I'm just thinking to all of those funding pages and they're all vary, but I understand how the deferral would work. It's just I'm trying to think if there's an easy way to spot it, but that's for another time. Let me ask you, you know the saying, they don't build them like they used to, right? And it goes for everything. Like old stuff's better, new stuff's not as good. I want to just get your take on like new construction. There's like, condos are coming up. There's tens of thousands of units that they're completing this year and next year. And then in 27, there's literally nothing because nobody can launch and sell a project right
Yeah.
now. So it's
Yeah.
going to be an interesting time. But for
Yeah.
the ones completing right now, I've done some PDIs, like some inspections before closing and stuff. And I mean, it's normal to have like over 100 deficiencies. And these are small cosmetic things. But I'm just wondering from your perspective, like, how do you feel about things built in the last 5 to 10 years? Is it as good as before? Is the quality lessened? What's the takeaway here, just in terms of general? I know it will vary between builders as well, but I'm just wondering, how do you feel about quality in general?
Um, it's a really difficult question. I would say because there's so many different forces acting on the marketplace. So for example, the average condo 25 or 30 years ago was a single tower in a field with a parking garage, right? Pretty
Right.
simple, like anybody can get their head around it. The average condo now, 40 stories, tight to the sidewalks, commercial on the ground floor, no site, complex deep parking garage or automated parking system, like they are chaotically more complex, right? So it's hard to compare them. They are much more challenging buildings and financially they're much more challenging. Like if I have 200 units in a 20-story building, it's much cheaper to repair than 200 units in a 60-story building because
Okay.
it's just so difficult to work on those buildings. So there's that influence, like the kind of increased complexity. And then there's been a burdening of condos. So we've decided in our wisdom, when cities and developers are negotiating the new condos, the one person who is not at the table is the condo owners who are going to pay all of the bills for that building, right? And so in those negotiations, everybody gets what they want. The city gets the new daycare, the city gets the commercial units on the ground floor, the builder gets more density, or he gets whatever he gets out of it, to be able to build it. But the condo owners end up holding the bag at the end of the day. And so they're faced with very, very complex cost sharing agreements, that they're barely intelligible, right? Because if they are even intelligible, like they don't match the building as it's built. There's a lot of problems with cost sharing. They may also have, let's say, an obligation to maintain a public park that's accessible to everybody else. They may have an obligation related to, say, a daycare center that's in their building where they actually pay a lot of the costs related to that facility. There may be an affordable housing provider co-housed in the same
Right.
building. There will be going forward on many of them. And so all of these things make that new building just significantly more complex. So we have a huge increase in complexity. And then we have the construction. There's two parts to that. One is quality, right? Where in the old days, we build out a brick or precast concrete, and it was pretty simple. And could you screw it up? Obviously, right? There's some lemons always, right? Where somebody did something wrong and they did something to accommodate it. But generally, they were just boring, simple buildings. Today we're getting much more complex in the materials that we choose. Like as of January this year, we can only buy condensing boilers, whether or not your HVAC system was designed for a condensing boiler. A condensing boiler doesn't last as long as an old atmospheric boiler. Now, an old atmospheric boiler is terrible from an energy perspective. So what's the improvement, right? Like I have a crappy old boiler that uses way too much gas, or I have a fancy modern boiler that uses much less gas but doesn't last as long. And so it's hard to answer if that's an improvement or not, right?
Okay,
Um,
so you know what? This actually answered it. I was asking the wrong question because it didn't dawn on me. This is not a question of perceived quality. This is exactly a question of complexity. And the
yeah.
easiest analogy to use here is cars. I'm obsessed with cars. I can talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
cars all day long if you'd like. But the way my 1992 Honda Civic hatchback CX when I was in high school. I used to work on. I could do it with just a basic tool set from Canadian Tire, fix it up. It would get me A to B, and it was great. And whereas the car I'm driving now, like I don't do anything because it's a computer. It's literally a computer on wheels. So I think that probably makes sense, which then is the bigger risk now is that these more complex things become like with cars, they become throwaway items because sometimes it's just not worth fixing because it is so complex. So I wonder that is probably going to be very interesting to see how it pans out in the future. So it's not about quality, it's about the ability to service these things in a cost-effective manner. And reading in between the lines, the cost-effective part is likely not going to happen
Yeah,
because
and it's going to get worse going forward because we have now this push to net zero, right? So we're going to decarbonize. So a little bit like your car, go back to the car example. You used to have a gas engine, now you got a big battery pack and a computer.
yeah,
And so go in and fix that battery pack, would you? Well, you can't, right?
no.
And exactly. And now we need to do the same thing with the building stock is from here in the next 20 or 30 years, we need to get the gas out of those buildings. So we have to convert all of the buildings over to electric. And what's interesting about that is that when you do that, you basically have to put in more high-tech equipment. So, heat pumps rather than boilers. And they can't manage the coldest days in the winter. So you get to put a gas boiler in as well. So now you're
Oh,
going to
wow.
twice as much equipment that's worth more money as well. So it's going to get even more complex, unfortunately. Now, I mean,
Wow.
it is a net improvement to the planet, so there's an upside to it. But from a pure cost perspective, the condo is going to have to own more stuff, like more equipment to do that. So and I worry about that. I have a 25-year-old daughter who I wish could afford to buy a home, but she can't, right? She's not paid enough to
Yeah.
barely rent, right? So um, and I think we're gonna, we just keep making this housing more expensive. Let's put the affordable housing in and those units can't have big fee increases, so everybody else will subsidize them. Let's put a
Right.
public park in and this unit can maintain, these condo owners can maintain it instead of the city maintaining it. It was putting cost into what should be the most affordable form of housing, right? Rather
Wow.
than getting cost out of it. And so that stinks for the young folks because it doesn't work. And then we need to, if I right size those fees, imagine if I could go back in time to 2015 and I actually convinced the government to change that 10% of operating to 30%, which would have driven up fees in condos, which would have driven down values because the banks wouldn't lend us much, which would have helped us not get where we are now, right?
I
But we
yeah, I'm
deliberately decided not to fix that.
well, exactly. So this is why condos create such a big risk for buyers and sellers and owners. So I've been very vocal about this that in the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's already happening. We're gonna have a massive repricing of condos in Toronto simply by way of quality or flight to quality versus things that are complex, things that, gonna go over budget and things. I think the repricing is gonna happen I'm kind of watching the Vancouver market. So in Vancouver, this has been happening for different reasons. They have insurance reasons. They have, a lot of them are stick built versus concrete, the older condos, and they've had condos, I think, at scale for longer than we have. I think they started with the condos earlier than we did, at least my understanding of it. And they have been going through a repricing right now. Some condos there right now are just land value. Whatever the land value or the gross floor area you can build on, that is how they will allocate whatever the unit is worth. And that's it. You just kind of sit, you pay your maintenance fees, you bite your time, and eventually all of them get bought out and a developer will buy it. So I do worry that this is going to happen, or it is happening slowly here in Toronto, especially in the core. Like if the going rate on a per square foot basis for a half decent condo is, let's say, 900 to $1,000, and you have a lot of this pre-construction stuff that's sold at $1,600 per square foot that's coming online now, and there's no way in hell they're going to get 1,600. Like they're selling for 1,100 square foot in the assignment or in the off market, which is another craziness because people are losing their shirts. So I think this repricing is going to happen by way of obviously aging stock, but also by way of certain buildings, for example, low rise or mid rise lofts and nice locations that you simply cannot afford to build ever again, just because, they have good floor plates, they take up a lot of land. I think those will preserve value, but all these skinny, complex towers with the quote unquote dog crate condos where it's just commodity stock, I don't know how they fare long term because it's like that there's nothing of value here realistically because they're not very livable. The layouts are just long, skinny things that nobody wants. There's no windows in the bedrooms and things like that. So I do think there's going to be repricing by way of quality, complexity, and what's going to happen with these maintenance fees. So I don't know what your take on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't play in that side of the world. I don't know pricing of condos. I know
Think of it
reserve
from a
cost,
maintenance fee. Think of it from a maintenance fee perspective
maintenance
because the
fees.
second
Well,
maintenance fee skyrocket, it's over.
do you
The
know
only
what's
saving
interesting?
grace, sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, the only saving grace that how they're getting away with it right now, because condos have become so much smaller on a per square foot basis, you don't feel the fee increase. Oh, it's $500, but you're in a 310 square foot condo that's 2 years old. Like it's old way like it's
You're giving
insane.
me the shivers.
Yeah.
So, when I first started working, I started working in September 1990, which was just after the crash. Like, so in 89, there was a big crash, right? Huge condo boom. They stopped building, basically. Very similar. It feels the same now as it did in 1990. By 1994, I think prices had dropped about 40%, basically, before we started to build again. So, I suspect it's, I feel like that's a good educator, perhaps, is looking back at that 89 to 94 period. Um, I think that, maintenance fees, there is going to be significant upward pressure on maintenance fees, especially if net zero is forced on condos. So it's not just the carbon tax, it's actually the cost of retrofitting these buildings to get the gas out of them is not insignificant, right? So that's expensive. The cost increases on the reserve side are significant. Obviously we want the governments to get inflation under control, but then here we're having these tariffs, and how do we protect Canadians from tariffs? We give them money. Well, the government gives you money, that means that the value of your money is going to go down. So, and when the value, when there's too much money, we're going to get inflation again. So it's just like, I just feel like it just keeps going from bad to worse. And I wish there was a way to solve it. And it's funny, I personally regret not yelling louder to make a bigger scene about the first year reserve contributions, because it was so easy to see the writing on the wall. You know what I mean? I can
Yeah.
remember sitting, someplace at a conference saying, but if they let the fees be, like, if they lie about these fees being low, then the people are borrowing too much money. Like, we need to get them not able to borrow the money, because basically whatever you're able to borrow, the builder will sell the unit for.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so if nobody
100%.
can borrow more, then the builder's going to sell for less, and either he can make it work at that point or he can't. But we let it get out. And then how do you correct it without, if you improve it for the young folks so that they can afford something, the folks who bought it in the last 5 years are in a complete mess. We've created a very nasty problem. Like, I wouldn't want to be the boss of the world trying to sort out how you extricate yourself from this, because a lot of people get hurt, and it stinks, right? Because nobody buys their home hoping to lose a fortune on it. I saw an
Yeah.
article this morning about Terrion paying out 80 million in deposits that have been, related to builders gone bankrupt or illegal
Oh,
building and stuff. And it's like, that's a huge number, right? That's a terrifying
yeah.
number too. So, but I think you're right. I think I mean, things have to get right sized, but
Right
it's
sized. Yeah.
painful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Repriced, right sized. I am not a fan of pre-construction condos at all. I never have. I have not been overly vocal because I don't want to argue with people. And because I understand their point of view, pre-construction condos have minted more millionaires probably in the
Yeah.
GTA than anything else. I just don't know anything else. And it's just appreciation over the last 20 years. So even when builders were selling at 1,600 square feet or 1,700 square feet, and I had friends asking me, should I buy this? Is this a good deal? And I'm like, I'm laughing. I'm like, of course it's not. You can go down the street even then, buy a 1,200 bucks a square foot in the resale space in a somewhat vetted condo. So why would I go and spend this? But because it's all about the payment plan. You don't need the money up front. You're gonna hang out for 4 years. It's gonna appreciate into the price, all this stuff. And I remember even in university when I was graduating in 08, 09, I had friends using OSAP money to buy pre-construction back
Oh,
then.
yeah.
But that's when pre-construction used to cost on par or sometimes less than resale stock. And then it made all the sense in the world because you buy pre-construction at Highway 7 and Warden back then where nothing was built in Markham. And then 4 years later, you've graduated, everything is good, and then you've made literally 100 grand on the 20 you used from OSAP. Like it was just nuts, right? So it's so ingrained that to this day, people are, they're willing to just put their blinders on and forget about the resale market. But I think now a lot of people have been hurt, like thousands, because thousands of units are coming online and they're all underwater. Every single one is underwater. Obviously, it's not, people don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about this type of thing, but it is very unfortunate because it was clear, at least to me, it was clear that it was going to happen at one point. We just didn't know when. But we had a great run while it lasted for those
Well,
that
that's it.
can.
I think what's interesting too is people sometimes get confused. Like in Canada, I'll hear about people saying they're going to walk away from their deposit. You know, they bought something and now it's coming to closing. They walk away from their deposit, so they're going to lose $400,000 or something and walk away. But that what I don't think they realize is that even when they walk away from that, when it comes time to close, they're still obligated to their purchase and sale agreement, right? So if you
Yeah.
said you're going to spend 1.2 million on this unit, you may have walked away from your $400,000 deposit, but if the builder can only sell it for, less than the 1.2, he's going to still come after you for the delta. And
Yeah.
so people get used to, in 2008, when the US markets were kind of crazy, people were walking away from their homes, leave the keys
Yeah.
and walk
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
And they can do that in the States. We can't do it
Yes.
here. Even when you leave the keys and walk away, you're still on the hook for how much is owed to either the vendor or to the mortgage lender. So you don't
Yeah. No,
get to just walk
100%.
away.
No,
Yeah.
there's no walking away here. There's precedent, there's case law. It's super simple. I
Yeah.
mean, the only way you walk away is if you want to declare bankruptcy and literally just put your life on hold for the next 10 years. But even then, there's going to be pain, right? No, here you're not walking away here,
Yeah.
definitely. And
Which stinks, I get so worried about the kids who bought in like 22 or something. I just think,
yeah, and I can tell you lots of stories because most of those condos, okay, I don't want to speculate most, but from what I know, a lot of them are bought with equity from homes. So it's like they just basically, it's not like the money was there free and clear where you just went and purchased it. They didn't have 200,000 cash on hand. It was borrowed. Parents, I've had to sell parents' homes who had reverse mortgages because they gave money to their kids and then the rent rates went up and then the mortgages are coming up and then they're going to take more of your equity. It's like, oh my God. So there's all kinds of stuff happening on the it's unfortunate. Obviously not everybody, and I think for the most part there's still a lot of people that are mortgage free, but the ones that have participated in the real estate market in the last 5 years that were ill-advised or decided to just put the blinders on, unfortunately there's nothing. It's just a lesson. Time goes on, you're gonna figure it out, and in 5 years, hopefully, you're fine. But there's gonna be pain on the way there.
yeah,
Um,
it stinks. It stinks for those folks, that's for sure.
but we could use lower prices. Like, I
Yeah.
have kids, they're much younger, but I do hope that they will be able to live here. So or at
Mhm.
least I hope as a family we can kind of live close to each other, not them living in a different province or something because they can't afford housing, which is the biggest issue, right?
Yeah.
Like pricing is still very expensive. So I
Just
wouldn't
in an
mind.
impossible, the 20 somethings, I look at them, they're just in an impossible position. Even if you have a great salary, there's not enough money to buy a home. And that
Yeah,
stinks, right?
it
Yeah.
does. It does. And without them, like where is this place gonna go?
Yeah.
Um, I think you've answered this question. I was going to ask you, but it seems like it's probably a drop in the bucket here at this point. So amenities, what's your general take on amenities in general? Like how do you, because I know it's a loaded question. I think for example, I'll give an example. I love buildings with no amenities, but that's because I generally I'm biased towards smaller, mid-sized buildings. So less amenities, but less units. And then you have places with a lot of amenities, but a lot of units. So you have the economies of scale to absorb the costs. So I'm just always kind of confused, but so I am amenities phobic. I don't want them. I want nothing to do with them. I don't want to pay for a swimming pool I'll never use. I don't want to pay for any of this stuff. But what's your take? Is that an overreaction from my end?
So two things. One, there's a tricky thing that happens. So amenities, I don't, they are expensive. I mean, and I've been through so many condos would have swimming pools, and I have seen probably three swimmers in my 35 years looking at residential condos. So I think the pool is your biggest expense from like, there's operating side expenses as well as reserve side expenses. But if I look at reserve side, so let's just focus on reserve for a minute because that's my thing. If I put up this graph again, you can see the graph again, is that right?
Yeah, I can see
It
it.
shows expenditures. So look at those windows up at 23 million. Look at the interiors. So that's all your interior finish renewal, right? So that's look at just under 15 million. So not insignificant, right? But if I look at that let's see if I can do this on a percentage basis, interiors in this building were about 12% of the total cost. And then if I
Wow.
break down interiors, I get amenities are about a quarter of that. So on a reserve perspective, in this building, the amenities represent sort of 4% of the cost. Like they're not going to move the needle.
Wow, this is very enlightening for me. I did not. So to me, it seems. Um, very gross generalization. Amenities are not as material as I thought. I thought for sure
Well,
they
it
would.
obviously depends on the number of units, right? So
Right.
this one, let's say this one's probably around, I don't remember exactly, but about just under 200 units or something, right? So it's 4% roughly. And it's a complex building, has a lot of roofs and stuff. So it's a high-end building. It's an expensive,
Okay.
nice condo. And it's 4%. You could go, obviously, if you had 50 units and an indoor swimming pool, it's going to be more material, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or if you, and then, but there's another interesting twist, and I'll tell you another interesting twist. There are some buildings that have that have no amenities, right? And you'll buy in when they're new, but because they have no amenities, they have a very low operating budget, right? Like you'll go into the building that has no security, no amenities. It's just like go in, there's an elevator and a parking garage. And you think to yourself, well, that's good. It's going to be much cheaper to run. And it is. But the shock from first year to second year is going to be higher because the reserve is now based on 10% of a tiny operating budget.
I
So that
see.
reserve contribution is probably going to go up by a factor of 3 or 4 rather than a factor of 2 or 3. Now it's not, I mean, again, it's everything is relative, but sometimes the delta, the percent change on those buildings is actually worse on the new ones than on the ones that are amenity rich and have a high operating budget. So it's kind of, there's a kind of perverse aspect to it there. The amenities, I always look at the amenities to me are just like they're the curb appeal. When everybody's selling their unit, they're going to show the pool and the sauna and the this and the that
Yeah.
that they've never used themselves.
Right.
And for some reason, when people are buying, they like them, right? But I agree with you. Like if I were buying a condo, it would be amenity light.
Yeah, well, this is just like cars. They always advertise the feature. It can tow 11,000 pounds. It can, but you're never gonna do anything. You're gonna get a bag of mulch from no frills, and you're gonna go back home, like settle down, right? So this
Like
is
when
what
they
we're
sold
doing.
me my van when I had the kids with the power door and you had to push the button to open the door.
Yeah.
And okay, all I want to know is when the button doesn't work, can I just open the door?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay, fine. Then I'll
Oh,
take it.
that's funny. That's so true. So let me. Okay. So here's. I'm gonna ask you the impossible question. Let's
Sure.
say you're 25 and you're making a ton of money
Oh.
right now, and you're looking to buy a condo in the city of Toronto. How are you gonna go about like I guess what are the considerations you're making as you're shopping for a condo, whether it is amenities, whether it is years, like how do you approach this entire thing? Let's say we're location agnostic, like you can buy anywhere. You're just and let's say obviously you want a nice floor plan and you want this, you have your little things, but when you're looking at these condos and you're looking at 10, 15, 20, 30 condo units, how like what are you thinking of in your head? What's the calculus with everything you know? In terms of that. I know this is very hard to answer because it's very general and but
Hmm.
I'm asking you to do the impossible just to kind of let people know how to think. That's what I want. How do you think about this? So amenity light, I like also unique because from a resale perspective, I feel it's hard to, nobody's going to build a nice loft, 9-story loft now. It's impossible. You got to
Right.
go 40 stories, 60 stories. You just can't do. So for me, this is all good. You know, floor
I worry,
plate.
you know
Yeah.
what I think I worry about. I mean, if I were buying it, I'm very reserve biased because I live my life in reserve funds, right? So my instinct is always to see whether or not that's in hand. But
Yeah.
partly because if I look at a notice and I see, they're supposed to have a reserve fund study within 3 years, but they're past due,
Yeah.
something's up there, right?
Yeah.
Or they got huge increases going forward that are above inflation. Something's up there. Like and to me, it's kind of a measure of the mismanagement of the board. If they're mismanaging that, which is very tightly regulated, what else are they mismanaging, right? So that's a little
Right.
bit. I don't know how you judge the boards because you don't get to meet the board to know if you've got, solid, hardworking, great volunteers or you've got some crazies who hate each other. Like I don't know how
Yeah.
you judge that. I think I would like, a lot of the complaints are noise transfer and odor transfer. So obviously I don't particularly want to, as much as I like pizza, I don't want a pizza oven right under my unit. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
I don't want a gym that's 2 stories below me because the dropping of the weights is going to drive me crazy. But I don't know how you judge that. I mean, I personally would look to make sure I have concrete shear walls between me and the adjacent units and not just drywall separations, although some drywall separations are great. But the building code doesn't require much sound transmission resistance between units, right? So that's my biggest pet peeve. And then
Yeah,
odor,
that's
I don't
huge.
want to, no smoking for me would be absolute, like nobody
What about
rents.
pets?
They're still
How do you
small.
feel about no pet building versus pet restricted buildings?
Do you know what? I always thought I was a dog person my whole life because I had a dog when my kids were little and I loved her. But
Yeah.
then my daughter convinced me the other day I'm not a dog person after all. I only like my own dog. Dog animals are interesting. I feel like it's part of the sad equation in the sense is that if young people can't afford homes and then they can finally afford homes, but they can't afford a family, they get a dog. And so a lot of the buildings are completely overrun with dogs. And that causes some problems, right? There's just
Oh
too
yeah.
many. Yeah, we had one where they had a fire in the elevators, and so you had to walk down. And when you have to get an old dog out of the 10th floor of a high rise in the morning, it's tough, right? To get
Yeah.
them out in time to get to the grass. So it's tricky. I mean, and so I don't love them, but at the same time, people love their dogs, right? So you're never, never gonna get
Yeah.
rid of them.
Well,
So
there's also the rules I've seen imposed. Like if you have a dog, like certain condos won't allow you to, they can't walk. You got to carry them through the
you got to
common
carry them,
areas,
yeah. If you get a
right? So they're
Labrador or something, good luck.
yeah, yeah. Good luck. Maybe the Labrador is gonna carry you. It's crazy. So I know of two things that are just non-engineering related in terms of how to get insight as to the condo, and I think I might have mentioned this to you before. I'm probably on hundreds of Facebook groups for
Oh yeah.
specific condos, and if the biggest like thing people watch for that, like I had one client recently, she's awesome, but she's very thorough, which is really good, but it's sometimes challenging because you can't answer all the questions. But she's very thorough, and it not in the sense that she's picky, but she wants to know what she's getting herself into right out of the gate, and I
Yeah.
really respect it. So ultimately, if like for example, her thing is cockroaches, she owns multiple units, and once you get a cockroach, right, especially with these commercial like mixed use buildings, let's say there's a Tim Hortons at the bottom or a Longo's. I've personally owned units like that where I know that these things can happen, and then how the condo board handles that, it will vary greatly. Some of them immediately they're going to come and fumigate stuff like right, the whole building. Some will just fumigate one unit, some will do nothing. So I kind of creep on these Facebook groups, and it's hard to get into them because you have to be an owner or a tenant. But if you're a realtor, you can kind of weasel your way in. And then, I think one of the safest ways to look at things is just the owner to tenant ratio. That has always been the golden rule. The more owners you have in a building, the better it's going to be, generally speaking. It hasn't failed me just yet. Because the more like if you have most buildings downtown specifically, if you're 50-50, you're doing good. If you have more than 50% owners, you're doing very well. But you go to Mississauga or Markham, like 70% of the people are owners, not tenants, right? And the pay
Yeah,
depends on the age
exactly.
of the building. So that's where it gives me a little bit of comfort. But then there's building is like 80% tenants, and good luck. Like what you're dealing. Like it's anything that potentially is an issue is going to be an issue, and you can search the Facebook groups, and there's not as much involvement. People don't care as much because they're there temporarily. What do they care about somebody on the fifth floor with a cockroach? It's like I'm out here in 5 months. I don't care. So
Yeah,
those
it's
have been,
interesting.
yeah,
The renters, I don't, I know some buildings where the renters are great, like but I think it does depend. It goes back to that 25-year-old conversation. Not only can my daughter not afford to rent, but the only way she could rent is if she had a roommate or two.
yeah,
And so you're kind of cramming a bunch of people in together who don't really want to be together into a lot of units that aren't big enough for that many people. So you get a lot of population, I guess, in those buildings. A lot of Airbnb, so a lot of transient folks.
yeah,
I don't know. And then the pest stuff, I don't see a lot of problems with pests in condos, or certainly that aren't flagged to me. Do you know what I mean? I
yeah,
do in some of the rental buildings more, but even that is a tough gig, right? You say to the landlord or the condo board, we have cockroaches and they want to come in and fumigate, but the very places that need the fumigation the most are the ones with the mess that can't be fumigated,
yeah. Right,
right?
right. That's true. I dealt with it.
And
I've
the,
dealt with it
you
in
know,
the
the other
past.
lesson that's striking to me is the more units I go into in my life, the more I realize that most people are not very neat and tidy,
Oh, yeah, we can
which
swap
is always
stories on
shocking to
that.
me.
Oh yeah,
I live in a world where the world is fairly pristine. My kids are growing up. I have lots of time on my hands. So, my world gets
yeah,
to run like a clockwork machine. And so I
yeah,
go into some people's houses and the disarray is significant. And that's when you start to get the cockroaches. You can't fumigate a place that's in a mess, right? Where you can't get
yeah,
it. So anyways, but I don't hear about it much. I really don't hear about that much in condos, but not that they would come and tell me, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm
That's not
not
your
really,
problem. That's not a
yeah,
problem for you to
exactly.
solve anyway.
That's not a
That's a problem for
Sally
them.
problem.
Yeah. I mean, the way you're going, it might start becoming your problem because
No,
you
I
are
hope
solving
not.
for.
I hope not.
Okay,
But I do
so
think you know what, I mean, going back to what I would choose, I would look for, I think low complexity, and I also have this theory that says you shouldn't be too high in the building unless you have your own AED, which is a terrible thing to say. But
AED.
if you're a defibrillator, because if you have a heart attack up too high in a building, how are they going to
Oh,
get to you in time? Right. So,
well, it's things I did not consider. Yeah.
well, especially now, look at the traffic, right? Okay, call 911 at a high-rise building downtown.
Oh, you're familiar with ICE condos, I'm assuming,
A
on
little
York
bit.
Street.
Not terribly,
Yeah.
but yeah,
So I mean, it's no surprise, and please don't sue me, but like if you go there to look, so just to preface this before anybody gets upset, I have nothing against them, but there are some big issues there, and the big issue is exactly what you just said. Like, if you go there during rush hour, especially pre-COVID, I haven't been there in years. The last time I was there like 22, but even then, the lineups for the elevator are literally outside the building. Like, there's a single file of people waiting
oh,
15,
interesting.
20 minutes to just get to the elevator because, I think they have in one of the towers, I think they have like I don't know what, four or five cars. One's down, one's in service. I don't know but it's like always something. And you're dealing with, they're very tall. Like you want to get to
Mhm.
the 46th floor, and then there's like seven people that are getting off before you. I mean, there's the wait downstairs, and then there's the wait just to get up to your unit. And huge issue, huge issue. And I don't know how you solve that. I really don't. But that's just the quality of living. It's not the best. And that is a predominantly Airbnb building. There's some
That's
good about them
interesting.
as
But it speaks to a code problem, Vas, because our building code says if you're going to put in an elevator, you have to comply with this standard. So there's a standard for elevators. But the code doesn't say how many elevators you have to have.
that's crazy.
Yeah, so there's this kind of rule of thumb where they say we'll put in one elevator per 100 units or something. It's kind of a rule of thumb that gets
Yeah,
used.
which is too little in my
And
opinion.
in some cases, it's not enough because when you have one down, or two down, you're really short service,
Yeah,
right?
and then also there's the elevator management part that I've seen some condo boards. You're not allowed to book the service elevator between 3 and 7, just no matter what,
No matter
right?
what. Yeah.
You have some places where there's always an elevator at the first floor automatically coming and waiting, right? And I don't know how much programming goes into this stuff, but
Yeah.
it's like there are ways to do it better. I don't know if everybody does best practices, but I've seen buildings that with two elevators and I haven't had to wait. And it's like they're
Yeah,
not.
what's funny? It's funny. I know I've dealt with quite a bit of rental in my time too. And if you talk to the kind of the traditional old boy who owned rental buildings, he knew the one thing that always had to work was the elevators.
Yeah.
Because if a tenant has to wait every time or gets trapped in an elevator, they're moving,
Yeah.
right? They're not staying. And so they knew we have to have good elevator service. They have to be up, right? And so they spent their money making sure elevators were up. The condos are different. The condos have managers and they have service contracts and they have all of this, but it seems to be that I guess if you're the landlord and if you don't keep your elevators up, your tenants go away. And so it hits your bottom line. So it becomes very important. I think in the condos, it's just one more thing in a barrage of noise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think maybe they should be paying much more attention to elevators. Now, if they're underserved for elevators out of the gate because of the design, then you can't fix that,
Right. Yeah.
right? After the fact. So that part stinks. But yeah, I don't know. There are some buildings where we get in the performance audits when we do the warranty reviews and right after construction, we get a lot of complaints about wait times at elevators.
Yeah. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
so frustrating.
Final question for you. So we've talked about all the, I don't know, not the nice parts, but it's the parts that people need to be aware of. And I know in your book you do have actual actionable advice. So can you just maybe go over that in terms of if I'm an owner of a condo, or let's say I already own it, I've already bought,
Yeah.
and I want to, obviously things are not going to be in my control, but what can I do to to be more informed, maybe guide people in the right direction, maybe insulate the condo from bad decisions? Like what can I do as an owner of a condo right now in the GTA?
I don't want to be trite in this answer. That it's important to be involved, right? So in other words, like I'll go to AGMs at condos with 200 units and there's hardly anybody in the room, right?
Hmm.
Like this is a big investment. Show up and hear what's happening. The president's going to give a report, this sort of thing. Get involved. But then the people who do come to those meetings, sometimes I feel like they come with an agenda. They come pissed off at the board. I'm going to take him down. And it's like, hold on, time out, time out. This is one of the owners who's volunteered their time to take care of all of this junk for you for the year. And if you just go head to head with them, it's like, that's not very nice, right? So it's like, I mean, in my world, it's about be thankful to the board, right? Now, assuming you don't have okay, in the world of condos, we have kind of we have buildings where you have an okay board and okay owners, right? And life is good. Or a great board and okay owners, or a great board and great owners, and those things are all good. But the odd time you get a bad board and the odd time you get bad owners, right? And when either of those exists, it's much more difficult. But assuming that you're in the 70% where you have a fine board, they're doing their darndest. It's like, how do you support them? Be thankful that they're there, right? They are spending probably 20 or 30 hours a month taking care of the building so that you can just show up and open the door and walk in when you feel like it, right? And so be thankful to them, be supportive of them. If you notice something that's not right, politely tell the management office about it. Like don't sort of judge them for not having picked it up, right? Like be helpful, right? I was
Yeah.
in one building one day. I remember it was a building that was actually under court-appointed administration, which means it's at the end of the rope, right? They're at the knot at the end of the rope, hanging on for dear life. Court-appointed administration, they have no money, they have no room in their budget for anything. They've had to cut all their services, like they're in really sad shape. And a lady gets up and says, for the last 7 days, I've gone down the corridor and there's been a coffee cup sitting in the corridor for 7 days. And the manager is kind of like, oh, well, I'm really the cleaner. And I said, you know what? Pick up the coffee cup and put it in the garbage. You're an owner, for God's sake, right? Like
Yeah.
start acting like you own the building because you do. And they're all in it together. So it's like, how do you be supportive? How do you help provide information? How do you volunteer your effort? I go to so many AGMs where I'll show up because I'm going to present and they're putting out the chairs. I'll help put out the chairs. And at the end of the night, I help put away the chairs. Well, do you know who puts away the chairs? The board. Do you know who doesn't put away the chairs? The owners who just showed up at the meeting, who have the exact same responsibility as those people, right? As owners. So it's like, recognize that you're an owner, participate in the community, help organize a social event so you can meet other people, get to know the people on your floor, do something positive and valuable to your building. But don't just be the guy, I'd like those old, you're probably too young for this, but the two old men in the Muppets who just sat on the sidelines criticizing, like, don't be them, right? Be
Yeah.
helpful, be useful, take care of your own part of the world, give good feedback, be positive and respectful and helpful to the board. Like do that. And then quite frankly, if you want to have a say in things, then get on the darn board. But it's a lot of effort. So don't
Yeah.
don't sign up to be on the board if you just want to fix your pet problem. Because you don't
Yeah.
get to
Yeah.
pick and choose, right? You get everything if you get on the board.
I'll
And then
cut you.
what I always say is the coolest thing, and I think I put my acknowledgement or something in the book to that, was to say, I am blown away by the volunteers that I meet on the boards.
It's a
They put in
thankless job. It's
unbelievable effort. Like some people are
yeah.
doing 10 or more hours a week, easy, easy on condo business. And if they're in a big problem, and they take everything so personally, like your example with the windows and the special assessment. I can guarantee you that that board agonized over the decisions around that thing. It was not like they didn't care and just did it, but people sort
Of
of
course.
behave as if they did, right? So it's a tough job. But anyway, so yeah, that's it. Get involved.
Do you just this is one of those questions that doesn't land well, but do you think these board positions should be paid? I feel it may, like from my perspective, assuming there's scale and stuff, I think it may actually benefit, especially in the if the building is crap, if you can attract I, I don't even know what to call it, but
Hmm.
again, because the commitment is big and I
Mhm.
have had I've seen what it takes. I would never do, I don't have, not that I don't have the time, I just wouldn't be willing to put my time into it. But if it came down to I'm living in a building that I really want to be in and I see it going downhill, I would have no choice but to get involved.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if payment is the right thing, but it just, I don't know if that would make a difference. Just always wondered about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the industry about whether or not some buildings should have a professional director. In other words, you have your volunteers on the board, but maybe there should be one person who's an experienced condo lawyer, condo engineer, condo manager, maybe who can help make sure that you're staying on the narrow. Now the manager gives the board some of that feedback sometimes, but a lot of times the condo managers can be quite junior as well, or they're not necessarily in a position of authority to sort of set a stray board back on track.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know what I mean? So there is a lot of discussion about professional directors, and I don't know what I think about that. Like it ends up, I, I don't know. It's a
It's a can of
what I'm
worms,
amazed
maybe.
at is how many great boards there are without payment,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yes.
don't know I do know what motivates those people. They have time and they're willing to do it and they want to protect their own investment and they get caught up in it and then they take care of it. Now, the
Yeah.
odd time, I mean, I can sit in a board and I know the one guy in the room who is only here to protect his own pocketbook,
Yeah.
within the first 10 minutes or something of a meeting. Right. And that guy's a bit dangerous because his motivations are not right. Like he's not taking care of the fiduciary duty of the corporation. He's only worried about himself. So, because he's selling next year usually.
Well, that's kind of like all the investor buildings that they're coming online right now. That's basically the board right there. Defer,
Yeah.
defer, defer. Everything's great. And then as
I'm
long as they
a,
get out.
the big challenge we're actually seeing right now is I'm doing a couple. So we do the performance audit in the first year after registration, right? So the warranty starts at registration and then within a year you can make a warranty claim. And for the last 35 years, they'll have turnover within a few months of registration. So they've sold 50% of the units or closed 50% of the units. And so then the board that we're dealing with for the performance audit is the owner board, the post-turnover board. Now we're starting to see some of the buildings where they haven't sold 50% of the units yet. And so it's actually a declarant board who's
Mm.
making the decisions in that first year, which is a whole interesting twist. And I think the builders should be careful because they shouldn't, if they put enough of themselves, if they put too many builder reps on the board or friends of builder, it's the two
Yeah.
from the builder and his first cousins or something. Then when it comes to that is, make a decision that has an impact on the builder, they should all recuse themselves from the meeting. So let's say if there's a board of five, if four of them are working for the builder, they have to recuse themselves from a decision. There's not quorum, they can't do anything. So they've basically they've tied up the board, but they're not doing that. What they're doing is they're staying involved in the decisions. So when we're coming to them and saying for the performance audit, we need more information, they're saying it's not available. The builder reps on the boards are making decisions that have an impact on the builder, so they shouldn't be
Yeah.
making those decisions, right? They should have the corporation's interest at heart. So it's an interesting time. And that hasn't happened for 25 years because we've always had turnover. The units sell and
Yeah.
everybody moves on. But when you don't have all the units sold, then you get into these very strange positions. It's
Yeah.
gonna be interesting to see. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned a ton, and now I realize I know even less than I thought I knew.
Well, it sounds like, but you're doing the right stuff, right? Like saving those status certificates is pretty nifty. It's like because it does give you some comparatives. I think it's a good idea. But
Context. Yeah, I'm just looking for
yeah,
context because
yeah.
it's like it's so much easier when you have a baseline because a status certificate as a standalone document in absolute terms means very little to somebody reading it. Like you just don't know.